Building the rear differential on the XRAY X4 is very similar to building the diff on the T4. But either way, I'm going to show you how I do it in a very detailed way. And you're probably going to recognize a lot of the parts in the diff, even though the diff case itself has changed. The internal parts are still the same as on the T4. You gotta separate all the parts here, make sure that you don't lose any of the small parts of the diff. We got 4 shims here, 2 big shims, the outdrives, the outdrives of the diff. They come in an aluminum material. We also offer these in steel for more durability, and especially if you want to use the ECS ball bearing drive shafts, you'll need to use the specific ball bearing outdrives for the diff. But for this build, I'm going to use the kit aluminum outdrives. First thing I'll do is I remove the plastic gears from the mold tree. Take these out of here. What you then need to do is you need to make sure that all the gears are perfectly round, that there's no excess plastic left from the mold. So you can cut these pieces away with a Hoodie hobby knife. It's the best tool to use for this purpose. Just cut all these things away. Make sure that they are looking nice and smooth. To be able to have the smoothest possible diff action. Okay, now I'm happy with the gears. They all look perfect. So what we're gonna do then is we're gonna install the O-rings in the diff cases. So before installing the O-rings in the diff case, I'm going to soak them in silicone oil. In this case, I'm using Hoodie 7000 silicone oil. Make sure you get some oil onto these O-rings before you install them in the diff cases. And then put them in here, one in the top, one in the bottom diff case, and then we can install these large diameter shims on top of the O-rings. When that's done, we're going to proceed to install the outdrives in the diff. So here, it's a nice idea to drop a little bit of oil onto the outdrive to make sure that there's no excess friction going on here. So you put some oil on the outdrives before installing them into the case. Then, I'm going to use a Hoodie long nose pliers to install these pins into the outdrives. So we start with the top here. It's very easy, just put it in place. Push it in with your pliers. And we can already put the gear in place here. And turn the outdrive to make sure that it's spinning freely. Everything feels great. And we move on to the next outdrive. Push it into the housing of the diff. When it comes to installing the pin in the lower part of the diff, you have to look for the part of the diff case where it's marked here with 2 lines. that's the part of the diff where you need to install the little pin, because it's got a bigger opening in that side of the diff case. So once again, we grab the pin with the pliers and we put it in there in the spot where I just showed you. Push the pin in, put the gear in, and again we need to make sure that it's moving freely, and that feels great. Put this aside for now, and we're gonna start to assemble the small gears. We put these 4 gears on this plastic part. All 4 of them, and don't forget these small diameter steel shims that goes on the outside of the gears. So that's all done. We can install these gears into the diff. I do this before pouring oil into the diff. So put all the gears inside before you put any oil in there. Then we have the paper gasket, which is sealing the diff in the top part. It's a little fragile, so make sure you don't break it. We put this in here. And finally, we are going to put some oil in the diff. The most precise way to put the right amount of oil is to use a digital scale, which I'm going to use this one from Hoodie. It's great for this purpose. So what we do is we put the assembled diff onto the scale and we check what it weighs. It weighs in at around 9.5 grams, and I usually put 1.5 grams of oil into the diff. So this means that the number we're looking for here is 11 grams when it's ready. So we're going to use Hoodie oil. This is the 7000 oil. About the oil viscosity, you can fine-tune the hardness of the diff with different oil viscosities, and Hoodie offer oils as soft as 1000 up to even 20,000. The range which we usually try to use for the X4 is between 3000 up to 15,000. And the higher you go, the more forward drive you'll have, but the less side bite. So the less forgiving the car will be for low grip conditions. So a good starting point for lower grip is between 5, 6 and 7,000. And for higher grip, you can go up to 8, 9, 10, even 12 or 15,000, depending on the grip levels that you're racing on. And in this case, we're gonna install 7,000, which is a good starting point. And we put the diff on the scale, as I explained earlier. And we put the oil inside. It's important here that you put oil also on the outside of the gears, so not only in the center part. Carefully look for the weight. So now it's 10.7 almost, but we want to get to 11. So now it's 10.9. Just gonna add a bit more oil. And that's 10.99, so that's perfect. That's 11 grams weight, which means we have 1.5 grams of oil in the diff. The next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use the Hoodie air vac to remove the excess air bubbles from the diff. This air vac comes with an adapter for the differential. So you just put it in here and you can install your differential into the air vac. Close this, and we're gonna connect our air vac to a battery. You can also connect this to a power supply. It gives it even more power and even more efficiency, but it still works great on a 2-cell LiPo battery. So connect the air vac like that, make sure that it's sealed in the top, and we start the airbag with the button at the back. We hold the button for between 10 to 30 seconds depending on the amount of air bubbles that you see inside. And if you look closely, you can see that the air bubbles are escaping from the oil. And removing these air bubbles will give you a more smooth diff action and a more consistent performance. Okay, so we wait for a minute to let the air bubbles escape. After 1 minute of waiting, the air bubbles are now all gone and we can release the pressure from the airbag. So we open the top seal. You can hear the air disappearing. Take this out. Put this aside. The last step to close the diff is to install the included O-ring. This O-ring is the final seal of the diff, which we put carefully on top of the diff case here. If you are rebuilding your diff, always make sure that the O-ring hasn't swollen up too much so that it's not gotten too big, because it can cause leaking issues with the diff. So always make sure that the O-ring is in good condition and not too big. And I recommend changing it whenever it's gotten too big. So we then put the top case on. Look for the little notch here in the diff case so that it lines up with the two lines on the bottom of the diff case. That's the direction that it has to go. Put the top case on. If you've done this correctly, there should be no excess oil coming out of the diff when you put the lid on. And we then start to screw these 2.5mm screws in. You need to thread these screws in step by step, so don't do one side at once. For example, do them all together, but slowly tighten all of them until you have the lid completely closed. Make sure that you don't over tighten these screws because you can damage the diff case. Just tighten them down so that the screw is sitting snugly into the plastic. And that's differential. Perfectly built, feels great, feels very smooth, and we can move on to the next step. When you install the diff in the car, you have the option to choose either the high or the low position. The same goes for the front solid axle. And this tuning option is something that you're familiar with from T4 as well and other X-ray platforms. But there's a difference in the X4. And the low diff position on the X4 is the same height as the high diff position on the T4. So the diffs are naturally higher on the X4. And this gives you many benefits in terms of handling. The high diff position on the X4 is a very good option for asphalt racing or whenever you want the car to have the most corner speed and to be the most free. A low diff gives you a little bit less chassis roll, more stability, and generally a more consistent car, so mainly suggested for carpet racing. But the low and high diff positions are very useful tuning options that you can use to change the car's handling for different conditions. And The bearing eccentric holders, they also come in aluminum as an option part. Using these aluminum parts will give the car a freer drivetrain, which is mainly beneficial for stock racing or any competition racing. So the eccentric bearing holders in aluminum is highly recommended. And that's all that I had to say about diff heights. In this part of the build, I'm going to show you how to put the front solid axle together, which is really straightforward. You're probably familiar with the solid axle from the previous X-Ray card as well. It's a little different on the X4. It's been altered a little bit, so the belt position is now more towards the center line of the car. But anyway, the solid axle is very straightforward to put together. Just put this plastic cover on the pulley, and we then install the outdrives. The outdrives included are steel, but we also offer these in a special version, which is used with the ball bearing ECS drop shafts. So if you plan to use the optional ball bearing ECS drop shaft, you'll need the optional outdrives as well. But for this build here, we're gonna use the standard included outdrives. So just put these in here, install the screws. And that's the solid axle put together, and we can move on to the next step.